with this question of the defense of Earth, because as we've discussed on this show, this is a continuing regular issue. This question of these asteroid and comet impacts, this whole region of the inner solar system. And what really gets me, for example, is the fact that people think about these things. You ask a common person, they might be familiar with, say, the impact 65 million years ago, which is a huge, massive thing. But then they say, well, that was 65 million years ago. When's the next one going to be? These are so sporadic events. Is this really a thing to be concerned about? Well, if you take the really big ones, yeah, they're not too often. It's going to happen at some point. We definitely need to be prepared. But, the huge, huge, huge events are not, incredibly frequent necessarily. But there's a whole scale of activity that happens. There's a whole range of activity that happens in the solar system. And what got me was I was watching one of these reports from somebody who does some work in the military aspect. And he was making the point that the military has satellites to, monitor the whole Earth, to look for things like rocket launches and different things. They want to know in case an enemy country might be launching a missile or something. So they're monitoring all these things. But what they started to detect when they started putting up these satellites was they started to detect large explosions up in the upper atmosphere that were not being caused by human beings, that were not being caused by missile launches. And what they determined was that you have on a yearly basis, even multiple times a year. So multiple times every single year, you have explosions, on the scale of the type of explosions that were the bombs that were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, around 15 kilotons, 20 kilotons, small nuclear bombs. That size explosion happens multiple times every year. The thing is, the atmosphere is thick enough and the explosions happen high enough that most people don't recognize it. But you have, just to get that image in your mind, you have nuclear bomb-size explosions every single year occurring from relatively small asteroid and meteor impacts into the upper atmosphere. So that's the lower range of the scale. The point is you have a whole continuum of different sized objects. And once you get just a little bit above those sizes that happen frequently every year, you begin to get size objects that can come down and do serious damage. And it's not going to be too long until we get something, on the scale of what happened in Tunguska in Siberia, again, occurring somewhere in the world. So the question that, we wanted to get to here is, so you put it this way, 100 years ago, we would have been helpless to do anything about this. Today, with the current technologies, we could deflect an asteroid under certain scenarios. If we have enough warning time, and if it's of a certain size range, we could do something to stop it from hitting the Earth. But there's also scenarios that are currently outside of our capabilities, typified by the comet threat, for example. Yeah. But we could foreseeably develop the ability to handle even these larger threats. So you have, a period in which we couldn't do anything. Now we can do something, and in the future we can foreseeably do a lot more. So the question to pose then is what governs this change? What is underlying this process of the expansion of mankind's ability to act on the Earth and in the solar system? And the work we've been doing in the basement on this question of planetary defense, we've been making the point that this goes right more fundamentally to the work you've done in economics and to the question of energy flux density, for example. So you take even a simple example of mankind moving to these different levels of power sources. And you take, for example, the question of transportation and take how mankind's access to the planet and to the solar system has changed as a function of the increases of our energy flux density capabilities. So you take just the historical progression of a coal-based society where you can now power things like a steam engine, locomotives, trains. And you're expanding mankind's ability to move people, but also masses of goods around the planet into the interiors of continents on a much quicker and more efficient basis than you could possibly do otherwise. But then
you've got another factor here,
mm-hmm.
I think which you should emphasize at this point, that the solar system has a certain antiquity. And it also has its center, the sun, has a finite expected existence. What we're looking at is a changing solar system, so that you cannot presume that in these matters, of these impacts, you cannot presume that we're going to have the same situation just waiting for us until we're ready to deal with it.
Right.
What is happening, obviously, is that the solar system is changing constantly. And with that, this whole question of this defense of Earth is changing constantly. And the tendency is to say that we're looking at possibly an increase in the likelihood of events of this type.
We have the biggest danger, which is the assumption that you have this static system that's not connected with the galaxy, that's not affected by these larger processes of development and change. You know, that's the idea that you can just isolate the solar system from galactic processes or large-scale changes. I mean, that ideology is going to guarantee the extinction of the human species. If we're just assuming that we can just keep going the way we're going, there's not going to be any qualitative shifts in these processes.
That's why your zero growth is a threat to humanity.
Right.
Because the way they think is a threat to humanity. And maybe we should brainwash them so we can cure that.
They're calling for zero growth. They're calling for extinction.
Yeah, right, exactly.
They're calling for wiping out the human species.
Exactly.
Because they're calling for the human species to not do what we need to do to ensure that we can actually survive and progress.
That's my concern. And since we know that there's a history of the solar system, that it's finite, and that there is a terminal point expected for the sun. And we seem to be getting more and more in that direction. So therefore we have to presume that we're getting more running down, shall we say, to an end point. And we're looking for mankind to find new premises on which to dwell somewhere. But we would have to do a lot of developing in the process to be able to do that one.
Right.
But we have to plan to do it.
Which takes you right to these questions of the increasing power of mankind. Because if you're serious about doing anything in the solar system, we have to go full-fledged to a nuclear, but really thermonuclear capability.
We're talking really, in this case, we're talking about matter-antimatter reactions.
Yeah.
This is not a small business. But mankind, if you take the increment of man's ability, scientific ability, and it's pretty poor performance so far, but we know that without the oligarchical factor, which is a real deterrent to progress, that mankind can accelerate man's ability. Just think of how few people are actually doing serious scientific work. Just take what the rate of progress of physical science is, and you realize that a few people really accomplish a great deal. A great number of people make incidental contributions to the process, but the ones who make the principal changes, like at the beginning of the century, Planck, for example. Planck is an exceptional person who was really a driver, a predictable driver. But we actually have to concern ourselves about increasing the mental powers of mankind by orders of magnitude. And when you think in those terms, matter-antimatter is just on the horizon.
And that's going to be crucial for giving man the ability to do these things.
Exactly.
Because you're looking at these basic questions. If you want to deal with like this long period comet threat, the comet threat, even fusion probably wouldn't be enough to handle cases that we know about.
No. We're looking at the matter-antimatter limits, which is what we know is a limit so far. But that's not necessarily the limit. But that's the limit we know something about.
Right. It's like, it comes to, so you have that side, you have the question of the actual physical capabilities of mankind. But as you open with, what we want to get to here is then, how do we need to develop those capabilities in our population? What do we need to do to develop that scientific, creative impulse? Because as you just said, currently advance has been dependent upon a very small number of people. And so it's vital to expand the number of people that have the ability to actually think creatively, to actually break free from any cultural bounds or limits on any given state.
And I think the subject we're about to approach right now is highly relevant to this matter.
Yeah, exactly.
We can probably think by the time we finish this presentation, we will be able to say something on that.
Okay. So if you want to.
Yeah, actually, let me just pick up on what you said about the fact that our solar system is not only it's developing, but it's also finite. So if the human species has a prospect for survival, what we've got to do is begin the development process now that we can foresee can successfully lead us off this planet to establish human civilization in a different solar system. So already what you're looking at is a certain principle of a capability of the human species to operate outside of a normal kind of operation of time, of a certain, the past causing the present, causing the future. Already you have the ability of the human species to organize its activity outside of some linear notion of causality and time. And if you examine the role of the human species already, just even looking at the Earth, the way that the human species is operated on the Earth, again, you see very clearly that there is a higher principle of development, which humanity as a whole is plugged into, in a sense, which is driving and guiding the development of the human species over time. And I think Vernadsky has a really beautiful example of this when he discusses the development of human civilization on Earth. And he comes to the conclusion that in the 20th century, we reached a moment where the scientific thought of mankind was now the most powerful force for change on the planet, more powerful than the biosphere. That it surpassed the biosphere in power, in rate of development, and so forth. Now, his comment on this is that you're dealing with something very curious, because while the immediate cause of that power is specifically scientific thought and technologies, the ability for that to have happened took the individual actions of billions and billions of human beings, beginning from our first appearance on the planet. And so what he describes is the actions of billions of human beings who may have been acting with what they thought was a certain local purpose, whose the cumulative effect of those actions has added up to an undeniable unified impact on the planet, which is that the human species had become the most powerful force for geological change on the planet. And I think it should give people a little bit of an eerie feeling to think that through. That you in your own life might think you're acting on a certain cause and think you're acting for a certain purpose, but there's actually something outside of you which has been kind of pulling you forward and determining what the actual effect of those actions has been. Now you see this kind of quality of a certain causality which is outside of the moment, and an existence of a whole which is outside of the particular moment and the particular location in space and time, so to speak. You also see that with the individual creative thinker, and I think that's what we want to get into today with the example from Bach, is how to think like Cusa, the demonstration of how we can actually use music, the classical musical composition, to begin to think in this way and exhibit this natural species characteristic of man. It's important to point out, you never sense that as a passive thing. It's never just something which is impressed upon you. The way you actually discover that is through an act of creation, either musical creation and the recreation of the composition, or you look at the method of Kepler, which we've gone through on this show many times. It wasn't some passive noticing of an object he had never noticed before. He had to go through a process of recreation of the system in the mind, which is in no way different than what you could imagine a classical composer like Bach or Mozart doing. And I think that's the point, and what you brought up about passion is crucial, because any act of creation of a valid idea is always associated with a real emotion of passion and love.
Well, the concept of, if you take the equivalence of of Kepler's conception of science, and you look at music in that sense, as he did, actually, his work on music, which we did a whole research program, a crash program, to get this thing straightened out. No, and you say the vicarious hypothesis. And it's the same principle, exactly the same principle. We have impressions which transcend sense perception. That's their characteristic. Classical music, quartet, this, same thing. Transcend sense perception. The mind is now functioning on a way in which the mind in the ordinary sense does not function. The crude, ignorant person who has an opinion, but has no mind, because they're so busy with sense perception, they don't have time to spend on mind. And that's where the problem lies. It's the standard conception of what everybody accepts. So everybody will say, everybody knows, and nobody knows, essentially. No, this is where the difference comes in. You're forced to go beyond sense perception by creating a substitute for sense perception, which is based on mind, not on senses. And it's there. It's been there. It's been there with the greatest musicians that we have known. It's there and expressed also in classical poetry, ancient classical poetry, in the classical Greek and things like that. It's the same thing. It is not sense perception. And sense perception is for very crude things like going and peeing in the corner. And you hope nobody notices. That's the difference. Now, this is extremely important, because this connection and realizing that we're not talking about sense perception. You can start a stream of conversation on that subject of sense perception immediately, and that'll take you to nowhere, but to failure. It's the higher order that sense perception is inadequate to do, that mankind is able to adduce a quality of sense, what sense should be, which is not sense perception. It's not sense certainty. It's another element. And we used to be understood.